For this video, we're going to look at a bias trim to finish our edge. So here's an example of what it could look like. So you can finish the edge of a neckline or an armhole with a trim cut on the bias. I'll go through that in a sec, what I mean by cut on the bias. So this top here has like a low V, kind of like whitish shoulder, and then an armhole here. Another way you can use this finish is on a top which has straps. So here the bias trim is used for the neckline as well as the armhole, but it is continued to create a strap. This is actually a tie-up strap, but that's another way you can use this type of edge finish. So when we talk about bias, what bias means is it is a 45-degree angle to the grain line. So you can see here my strip for my sample is cut on a diagonal, and these here are my grain lines, depending which way you're going to line it up. So these grain lines should either be parallel to the selvage, or as you can see just here the weave of the fabric. So you can also use that as a guide. So you want them to be parallel with that as well if you don't have a selvage. I'm just using like a scrap piece here, that's why I don't have a selvage. Now if you don't line this up properly, you're going to really struggle with the process. So you need to make sure you get these grain lines parallel. Okay. And then we also have this piece here for our sample. So this is kind of like if you were creating a top with a V-neck and a strap here. So we're going to do our trim along here where the dotted line is, and along here, and continue it to create a strap. So again, you have a grain line here. I've just flipped it so I can line it up a bit better, so I avoid a bit of wastage. Alright, so what you're going to do is you're going to pin those pieces in place, and you're going to cut one of each. Okay, so I've cut these out, one of each, and before I take the pins out, I'm just going to flip this over with some tailor's chalk. I'm going to put an X on it because I want to indicate the wrong side. So with this calico, we don't have a right or wrong side to the fabric, so I'm going to mark it on there so I know. So I've taken my pins out of my pieces. This is my bias strip. Now this is, if we look at it, let's see how wide it is. It should be about 5 centimeters wide. Okay, so it's just over 5 centimeters, and that's a really good size to work with. You can do a little bit smaller, but the smaller it is, the trickier it gets to go through the process and get a really good finish. So to start, we need to prep our strip by folding it in half and making sure we really line up those raw edges, and we're going to iron that. So I'm going to go iron it, and then we'll move on to the next step. Okay, so I've ironed it, and because we've cut it on the bias, you'll have an end like this. So what I want you to do is just square that off. So just square off both ends. And then we can go over to the sewing machine and start. Okay, so to begin with, we're going to work with the wrong side of the fabric, and we're going to start with this long edge. Okay, so we've got, this would be like the V, this would be the center front, and this would be where the strap would go. So with the wrong side facing up, we're going to get my bias strip, I line it up, and I'm going to sew 1 centimeter from the edge, making sure I reverse stitch right on the edge of the fabric, and then continue to the end, reverse stitching roughly where that would end. Okay, take up lever up. Okay, so here I'm going to actually cut this off. Right, so very carefully I'm just going to fold that little bit back and I'm going to cut that off so it has a nice square finish. So now, this is what you should have. Now I'm going to reduce this seam allowance by half by cutting half of it off. And then we need to go to the iron. Now you need to use the iron for this type of trim. It gives you a much better finish. And without the iron, you're actually going to make it harder for yourself. So I'll show you what to do on the iron. Okay, so I'm at the iron. I've got my trim facing upwards. And really carefully, I'm just going to iron that over. And I want that seam allowance to stay in that position. Making sure this is nice and flat and open. So if I were to turn it over, that seam allowance should be facing the trim. Okay. Once you've done that, you're going to fold this over and iron it again. And this should be folded so it just covers the stitch line by like 1 to 2 millimeters. So fold it over, making sure it's covering that stitch line. Also make sure it's even, so the trim has an even width to it. When you use the iron for this, if you've got cotton fabric, having the steam function on is really helpful. Okay, so that's what it should look like, and we're going to stitch along the top now. Okay, so back at the machine, we're going to stitch along this edge here to have that trim sitting nice and flat. So we get my threads out of the way. Now, because this is a little bit thick, you might find your machine doesn't want to move, so you can grab your threads at the back and you can use them to tug as you start sewing. So you can toe tap. I'll just move that over a little bit. Toe tap and pull the threads to get it moving. Alright, little reverse stitch and then keep going. Trying to keep that stitch line nice and even. Go all the way to the end and finish with a little reverse stitch. Okay, so that's what your trim looks like for that edge. Now we're going to do this edge. So what we need to do is turn this over, because just like before we started with the wrong side facing up. We have our leftover piece of trim. We're going to put all the raw edges here and we're together, and we're going to line them up with that edge. So again, we're going to do 1 centimeter. Always do your reverse stitch, but what's different is we're going to go all the way to the end of the bias trim. So we're going to sew off and then continue. Little reverse stitch, take up lever up, cut your threads. Now just like before, we're going to cut half of this seam allowance off. So basically the steps are the same, except we've got this extension here which can be used as a strap. So half of that gets cut off. A little bit thick there, so go careful. Cut your loose threads. And then we're going to go back to the iron to iron it ready for the next step. Okay, so we're back at the iron. We're going to do the same as before. Carefully iron this over. But the difference is, now I'm going to flip it now, we need to iron this little section here up. And we're going to use that stitch line as a guide for where we fold it. So that's what you should have. Your seam allowance is ironed towards the trim. Turn it around, and then you're going to iron this over. So again, it's got to cover a little bit, but here when you get to the strap section, you can just meet the fold. So it should look something like that, but this section here, it's got to cover the stitch line underneath. So back at the machine, we're now going to stitch this flat, and we're aiming to get nice and close to that edge. For the strap section, the two folds should meet. Don't worry too much about the thread showing, because you will match your thread to your fabric, so it won't be as obvious as what I'm doing now. So again, just like before, because it's quite thick, I'm going to use the tails and toe tapping to get my work to move. Little reverse stitch, and then I'm going to continue pulling. It's a little bit messy because it's a bit hard to get going, but the end of the strap's probably going to be concealed somehow anyway. Here you need to make sure, I'm just going to put my needle in, this fabric is going to cover that stitch line. Just hold it down with your fingertips and go to the ends and do a little reverse stitch. Okay, so looking at the sample, this is what you'll end up having. Now this strap will naturally just go up in like an upwards direction if you were wearing this as a garment, okay? So that is the bias trim sample completed. This is the right side, which shows the stitch line nice and neat. And that would be suitable for either sewing with straps or without straps as well.